This is podcast number 10. This is probably one of the most important podcasts that I'm producing. I'm going to take you on a journey from Australia, from a bogus prince who destroyed my encryption company and all my partnerships with my colleague Carlos Morea, head of the United Nations TradePoint Secure Electronic Authentication Link, known as SEAL program, that we were establishing in Australia with the federal government of Australia, also proposing to link to the government of China as well, and other countries worldwide. This is going to be a journey that reveals the octopus. Danny Casolaro's mission was that he was coming back from Martinsburg with the head of the octopus. I'm going to show you how my evidence with the arrival of a bogus prince in Australia was related to Promis software, money laundering on a scale you've never seen, independent verification of all other sources that have been discredited, Michael Riconosciuto being discredited. Everything Michael has told me over 21 years, I've independently verified from records that Michael cannot see or know about, and knowledge that I had. So he's credible. That's why his records are sealed. B1, executive order by President. B2, sealed because of his knowledge of NSA, CSS, Central Security Services. And then B3, because it's classified as undercover of CIA. And that's why Danny Casolaro's records are also classified B1. It goes right back to when he was exposing the octopus components involved with the Watergate scandal that go through to the October surprise, Iran-Contra, and everything I'm going to reveal to you right now. But this is the journey from Australia. This is the journey of an intelligence operation so big that the pieces overlapped with my life purely by chance. And purely by chance, I was asked by a journalist to investigate Promis software and identify who the companies could be, and it turned out it was the same company that had been threatening me, because I was actually in a privileges inquiry as a key witness where the Federal Parliament Committee of Privileges was investigating overwhelming evidence that I had been threatened by companies that were owned by Rupert Murdoch that sold the Promis software to the Australian government. In the next podcast, I will prove to you definitively all legal evidence that Rupert Murdoch's companies that were threatening me sold the Promis software designed for Echelon, for NSA and CIA, to spy on the Australian government. But this is the journey. Let me go from a bogus prince. If you've watched the previous podcast, I definitively found in 2001, in the middle of my privileges inquiry, definitive legal cases of CIA operatives working for the director of CIA involved with the bogus prince in the Philippines in March 1997, April and May 1997, before he appeared and destroyed our programs. And remember, with the bogus prince was in Australia with a full delegation of officials and intelligent people from the UK and the US with him at a hotel for a week. I have all the correspondence and queries that we made with the Department of Foreign Affairs. Did he come in on a diplomatic passport if he's a true prince? Did they communicate with him given he's on TV and he's destroying a United Nations program? And how can he stay in Australia for a whole week and's never been interviewed by authorities? That had the smell of a joint intelligence operation to destroy the UN. Now, I don't know what my country does, but if they've sacrificed myself, my family, and my company, given the sacrifices I've made for our country as a trusted advisor federally and statewide, and been threatened, almost bankrupt, it's unforgivable. But let me present the evidence of my story revealing the octopus's head, and I dedicate this to Danny Casolaro, because I've uncovered the key people who were threatened by Danny are involved in the bogus prints scandal. This is independent evidence of Michael Riconosciuto, independent evidence of Bill Hamilton with his legal cases, but I validate his evidence. I validate Michael Riconosciuto's testimonies, and I validate all the evidence that Danny Casolaro had in his research folders as damaging evidence to the head of the octopus. And I'm going to take you to the head of the octopus independently so that you can see this isn't a made-up story. This is real. This is fact. This is evidence. It's legal documentary evidence that I found that validates what other people have been saying and have been discredited, and then it's impossible. So let's go through the journey. The most important thing is, just to recap, I've already exposed that I found the court cases of major fraud. No one was charged. They were all working with CIA, and a settlement of $58 million is made for people in Austria, given that they were laundering billions of dollars of gold bullion, US security notes and currencies worldwide. So let's go through now independent evidence of what I've already done and show you the evidence I found. This is myself, the author. This is Carlos Moret. He's the head of the UN SEAL program, and my company supported him and opened all the doors to the federal ministers and government, given there were the same company owned by Rupert Murdoch had been threatening me, was threatening and destroying him. And this is the evidence, and I have all legal evidence to confirm it, and I presented it to a parliamentary inquiry. So let's go on our journey. I dedicate this to Joseph Casolaro. He was brilliant. He was coming back with the head of the octopus, and I'm going to give him the head of the octopus independently from Australia, because he was going to do several chapters on Australia. He was going to have one whole chapter on the evidence that Robert Booth Nichols and CIA and MI6 destroyed Gough Whitlam and our federal treasurer, Dr. Jim Cairns. And for me to say this, I've been the science advisor to the Federal Liberal Party, and I've been the president of the Liberal Party for Phillip Island here in Victoria. So it's not political. This is unethical behaviour to destroy a democracy and hit them with a scam that destroys them and then deny there was no evidence. There was evidence. And I'm presenting the evidence that these people are the same people, and they did it to me and not only to other people. We're just fodder in all their damages, but they're criminals. And I'm going to show it to you. So I dedicate this. I want to give him the head. It cost him his life. 11 slashes on the left, then reaches across and does more slashes on the right. I mean, for God's sake. And it's ruled a suicide. Previous ones show what evidence he had. The evidence was never investigated. He was murdered. Everyone knows that. What's important is everyone keeps telling me, you've got to make it simple. It's not simple. That's how the octopus gets away with it. It is highly intelligent people. I'm a physicist. I understand quantum physics, solid-state physics, advanced maths, and advanced computer programming, and so does Michael Riconosciuto. You have to understand that our fathers of physics had to design brand new models because what they're observing didn't obey the rules. When you looked at a photon, when you looked at an electron, it turned out that they had to be able to map in 3D the probability of what you will see in 3D. And it turned out we had probability functions in 3D. And when you collapse the probability function down, then you can visualize when you will see it and when you won't. And that's what I had to do over 21 years. And I lived in Berlin. I lived at the Max Planck Fritz Haber Institute in the guest house where Einstein stayed, Max Planck stayed, these famous scientists stayed. And I was only 21. It's taken me 21 years to give you the head of the octopus. If you can put it in a simple story that the average person understands, good on you. I can't. I've got to tell you the facts, and I'm showing you the journey. And you will never solve it if you keep saying it's got to be so simple that anyone can understand it. They never understand it. Our job is to put it in TV series over many years to educate our youth and the world, how the world really works. I won't go through all this again, but I am a physicist, former trusted science advisor to the Australian Federal Liberal Party. So for me to have been revealing the stuff about Gough Whitlam, it shows that I am not biased. I will help anyone in government, no matter what side, and that's my credibility. Most important thing is, I'm going to now tell you what I told the Federal Privileges Committee about the bogus prints and about Rupert Murdoch's company. And I'm going to follow the trail now and give you the head of the octopus. I've covered podcasts on how we got destroyed, and I've also, pardon me for that, I have been reviewing for 21 years the real Promis software affair with Michael Riconosciuto, Bill Hamilton, and endless witnesses. 80% of them have passed away. I've still got my recorded interviews with them for historical purposes. They told their story. In the chronology right now, I'm going back to the very beginning, and I'm going to take you to the very end. Other things in here I'll do in future ones. But this is the bogus prints destroyed everything in Australia back in 97. And right at the end here, I'm going to give you this podcast. What was the octopus? Who is the octopus? What were they doing? And why was it part of Promis? And why was that what Danny was investigating? And why did they kill him? I'll give you the head and you can make your own decision. It doesn't rely on Michael Riconosciuto. It doesn't rely on Bill, but I independently have found it and can verify everything they said is true. And that's why I stayed with them for this long period. They've suffered huge injustices. Bill Hamilton almost bankrupted and destroyed with his family, and he's a patriotic citizen. Michael Riconosciuto has done immense things under national security for his country, and they imprisoned him for 20 years to defame him, project him as a drug producer, and has no credibility. The man's a genius. I thought I was smart until I met Michael Riconosciuto. He's a genius, and he's been defamed. I served as a science policy advisor. I've covered that, but trusted. I have always worked with distinction, integrity, and I always try to protect the Australian taxpayers, and I try and put public good initiatives together, not to make profit, but if you can financially make them viable, then they're sustainable. And so I've always tried to do my best to get a good business case for anything I do so that it's self-financing, but you sometimes need government seeds to get started. This you don't know about. In 1995, I exposed the R&D syndication rorts that were going on worth billions of dollars. In the files of the federal government, The chairman of the Federal Tax Concession Committee wrote several times to the Federal Minister for Industry, Science and Technology, Honourable Peter Cook, Labor, raising serious concerns that a company called ACCI, Australian Computing and Communications Institute, a research subsidised company owned by Rupert Murdoch, is considered the worst offender, repeatedly rorting the R&D syndication program. That's fact. The minutes exist, independent of me. In 1995, I was serving as the Science Policy Advisor to Honourable John Howard's Federal Liberal Party, and I successfully exposed the R&D syndication tax rorts that were being exploited by wealthy individuals and international banks worth billions of dollars, ripping off the taxpayers. It was published on the front page of the Financial Review. It's recorded in the Hansard. It was myself that did that, and it was complex, very, very complex. So complex, as a physicist, I was able to expose it, and it was true. I am trusted on both sides. There were advisors on the Labor side who said that the minister was so furious. There were footprints on the ceiling as he was doing somersaults because I was exposing something that happened under Minister Honourable Peter Cook. I like Peter Cook, but the fact was it was exposed by me, it infuriated him, and the only question he asked is, who is Peter Osborne and where did he come from? And how did he work this out? I know that firsthand from the science advisors on the other side. They're my friends and former lecturers and department officials who trust me. Everyone knew what I do is right. It turns out it gets shut down and exposed, and I'm locked in a room with all of the records, and it confirms, and that's how I know about the minutes. The minutes independently verified what I knew. I worked for Murdoch's company. I opposed it. I knew it was wrong. I was getting advised by science advisors from the Labor government not to work with this particular group. And I was being forced to work with them, repeatedly requesting not to, because I know they're tainted. And it's a rip-off. So Peter O'Keefe, the clerk assistant of the Federal Senate, came into my office while I was the science advisor for John Howard's Federal Liberal Party, and I closed the door and he said, I've written a paper and I want your permission. Can I use your name for exposing the R&D? And he said, I'm calling the paper When Ethics Fails and Groupthink Prevails. And the reason he did that was because the rorts were known within government bureaucrats, and they were too afraid to admit that there were problems, so they were covering it up. And of course all the wealthy individuals and international banks know that, and so they're ripping off the taxpayers. And it turns out it was me that exposed that the legislation was illegal because the minister had forgot to table the financial instruments in the House, so there were no guidelines or instruments to prevent someone from getting these tax breaks for doing nothing, taking no risk. And you couldn't reject them and you couldn't approve them. It was illegal to do both. I was the only person that knew that. Peter O'Keefe came in and said, Peter, what you did was amazing, but the thing that amazes me is, how did you work all this out and succeed? You're a physicist, not a lawyer. Well, that's correct. But I like to solve complex issues. That's my skill, that's my ability, and that's what it's taken for 21 years. To use every neuron I've got to understand something that's so complex. In 1996, whilst in the room are the directors of Johns Hopkins in the office of Peter Costello, Honourable Peter Costello, the Treasurer. If you watch the TV programs, they deny they even know me. I'm sitting in the room because I'm doing a presentation on our collaborative efforts with Johns Hopkins, my efforts, my company, and all my initiatives that I'm putting together, and they're in the room meeting Peter Costello for the first time. And he stops and personally thanks me for my role to expose the complex R&D syndication frauds, which he shuts down and saves the taxpayer billions, not millions, billions of dollars. We had to stop $2 billion of tax syndication applications that were coming, and then there were more that would be going on that were illegal. So there would have been even lawsuits against the government if they continued it, because you're approving people and that's illegal, and you're actually stopping people from getting it, which is illegal, because there were no financial instruments. So that's why Keith was so impressed with me, because I was the only person that knew the government would be sued for not allowing people to get the tax frauds. That's how complex it is. Anyway, I'm thanked. I just want to let you know that Robert Booth Nichols, just to remind you, turned up in the middle of the federal police investigation. After all the threats that I've covered already, he said one other thing. He told me he knew Ken Buxton. Now, he's made threats against me. I'm going to get a crowbar to the back of the head, telling me that I'm upsetting the most powerful Israeli businessman in the world, then telling me that he owned the Baron Abeith restaurant with the mafia, and it was used as a safe house for the mafia and the CIA during the Nugan years as their safe house in Melbourne up at the Baron Abeith in Victoria. He also mentioned the name, and I won't do it publicly, of one of her colleagues that I had signed agreements with business with the United Nations SEAL program. And it wasn't until years later I found his resume, and he actually had worked for Rupert Murdoch's company. I had worked for it. I didn't know he had worked for it. But he claimed that this person, he receives funding from the mafia. From him, Robert Booth Nichols. And he knows him personally. Now, I'm not going to do it because that person has not done anything wrong with me. I'm not going to name it. But Ken Buxton destroyed my career, federal and state, and had me threatened. And you'll learn more about this guy. But the fact is that it was Robert Booth Nichols that mentioned his name. After he contacted the SBS TV Dateline program, asking to meet with me and makes threats against my life, claiming he can help me with my legal claims against John Hopkins. For him to mention his name and make the threats and tell me my investigations on Promis are upsetting people shows me that I was right. Our whole UN program was destroyed by this bogus prince appearing in Australia in November 1997 and is publicised on TV, even giving more interviews with journalists to destroy us. Completely destroys us. I'm threatened that if I continue to work with Carlos Moreira and the UN SEAL, they'll cancel all my contracts as an advisor to the Victorian government. That was the government official, the director, I won't mention his name, who signed confidentiality agreements with my company in order to learn all of my proposals. They were threatening me if I continue work with them. And I was flying across to John Hopkins, which I did for 6 weeks, and I'm in the US due to meet with Carlos Moreira again to do our business partnership, and he's threatening me that if I meet with him and I work with Carlos Moreira and the United Nations SEAL program to stay away. He tells me that he's corrupt, that I've got to keep away from him. And I said, that's not right, because there's things I know that he was being threatened by and forced to work with Ken Buxton and Rupert Murdoch's company, or he would not get anywhere with the Australian governments. So there was a common thread here that the government's helping a company called Aki and Ken Buxton, destroying me and destroying the United Nations. And so let me show you a couple of things. Very, very important. I am a medical physicist. I've served as a national R&D manager for one of the largest diagnostic imaging and telemedicine companies in the world. I've been a medical physicist at our top hospitals in Australia, and I've worked overseas, helping in medical areas. I was considered a national and international expert on telemedicine and tele-imaging. That was my expertise, and I was asked to become a telemedicine advisor to the Victorian government. The director who's threatening me had signed a confidentiality agreement promising that he would never use all of the confidential intellectual property in 3 volumes that I'd submitted to a parliamentary inquiry as my own company that I had written with Johns Hopkins Medicine and KPMG, who were my business partners. I was considered and trusted internationally, and we had been working on this for previous years, and it was worth gold. And I was fostering a partnership between government and industry to invest and to do trials in our rural communities and also our poor countries so that we could deliver services. But the technology for doing that was e-commerce. It was encryption, it was payment of services, but it was real diagnostic, high quality information that could be certified and authenticated as accurate, and also leads to proven diagnostic treatment. So I was due to appear at the federal parliament a year later, which is in December 1997, just after the princes arrived, destroying everything, and I'm threatened again by the same people in the Victorian government. Told that they're going to cancel my role as the advisor and that I'll lose any contracts with them in any shape or form if I appear. And you can't do that. That's a criminal offence. Under the protection of Parliament, you can't threaten a witness. I've been invited as the witness. I've submitted as a witness. I had submitted before I ever met the Victorian government to become their advisor. So this was done for the federal side because I was the former federal science advisor and expertise in telemedicine. I've been flying around Australia to every state, helping every state government. I've helped initiatives federally and state, Western Australia, Northern Territory, and New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia. So I was well known and already established as a national expert in these fields. The most important thing that you have to understand is that at this point it's a criminal offence to have me threatened. I'm flying off to the US, and I stay in the US with Johns Hopkins for 6 weeks. So watch the TV programs, which I'll put up as podcasts. How can the directors, the president of Johns Hopkins, William Brodie, who was appointed to the President's Foreign Intelligence Board, he knows who I am, and they're all lying, saying they had no relationship with me and don't know who I am. It's just lying. But anyway, this is the part that's important. They threaten me so that I don't go, so they can appoint Ken Buxton, chairman of ACCI, the company owned by Rupert Murdoch, the one that's ripping off all the taxpayers in the syndication program, the worst offender, as their preferred telemedicine expert to attend the parliamentary inquiry. I have multiple degrees and research degrees. I've worked as a medical physicist in one of the top hospitals in Australia. I've been the National R&D Director of the biggest medical company that does telemedicine, telemedical imaging, respected by industry or governments, hospitals and health foundations, and Johns Hopkins, the most trusted medical school in the world, #1. And they appoint Ken Buxton. He hasn't any professional degrees or qualifications or experience relevant to telemedicine. And he's their expert. You figure. But the fact is they threaten me, so he goes instead. Now, I trigger in 2000, because it takes many years to get these up, but I managed to get a Federal Parliamentary Committee of Privileges inquiry into these threats launched. in January 2000. And it goes for 2 years. Very costly, very complex, and I'm talking about volumes of evidence that I presented. I presented my evidence of the threats relating to the bogus prints, the company ACCI, Ken Buxton, to the committee. What you need to understand is I did say something. I said, there's only one way. On camera, I said the following. This does not make sense. Everyone knows I'm a trusted federal and state advisor. They're threatening me and supporting a company that's ripping off the taxpayers. This can only make sense, and these are my words in camera. It's recorded in the record. This only makes sense if ACCI, Rupert Murdoch's company, is working with intelligence. That was recorded as my closing statement. It doesn't make sense that he's allowed to be supported and his company's given preference and it's ripping off the taxpayers and we're still throwing more money at it. It produces no results. It has no expertise. Mr. Buxton had no expertise. But they were my closing words. This makes no sense. You all know I'm a trusted advisor. Look who I'm working with, John Hopkins, KPMG, and the top foundations and hospitals who know me. And it only makes sense if they're protected. They're protected, and I sense they're a front for an intelligence operation or intelligence group. And I'm going to show you that I was proven right. Carlos Moreira, the head of United Nations, the following week after the bogus prints came in and just destroyed everything. Everyone's questioning everyone's credibility. Anyone near the United Nations SEAL program is being tainted, and he has a crisis. But he knows that I'm credible. He calls me. I meet with him again because I'm flying off to the US to be with the John Hopkins team. I've got their attorney, I've got their doctors, I've got the business director. We're all going to be going across to California to meet with Carlos Moreira. I'm there for 6 weeks. In January, we're all going to be meeting up in California for the launch of the United Nations SEAL program, and he's really upset about the fact that there's a bogus prince that's come in to destroy him, and he's been constantly prevented from establishing any collaboration with the Victorian government. They're aggressive towards him, and he's been prevented from talking or getting any cooperation from the federal government. So it's as if he's been shut down. And then he says the following. He confirmed that he was advised that unless he collaborates with a particular Australian company, he will never succeed in Australia. A meeting was arranged for him and he was introduced to Ken Buxton, chairman of ACCI, the R&D company owned by Rupert Murdoch. I had never mentioned anything like that to Carlos Moreira, and that was the evidence I needed. I already could see they were threatening me so that he could go up and become the expert on telemedicine and the medical encryption programs, and Carlos Moreira. As soon as I heard that, I picked up the telephone, I called Fran Bailey, honourable member for the Federal Liberal Party who's working with me and John Hopkins and KPMG, and we got our full support, and she opened the doors for Tim Fisher and myself. I put a lot of effort in, and we then got the government federally to support. So his block wasn't the federal, it was actually the Victorian government. And the Victorian government, for some reason, had some close relationship with Ken Buxton and his company with Rupert Murdoch that was trying to assist them to get all the encryption business, all of the healthcare telemedicine business exclusive as a government. I'm asked to work as a government advisor. This is a private organisation getting taxpayers' funds. And then my lawyers, during the inquiry, found that one of the directors of the Victorian Government Department of Health was actually sitting on as a board of director on the private company getting all the grants. And I testified in court, in the federal parliamentary inquiry, other evidence, and that is the person that they had there was the key person who the Royal Commission into the ambulance inquiry wanted to be able to question because she organised the Intergraph contracts. And I had uncovered that Ken Buxton's company, Aki, was getting contracts with the ambulance and Intergraph contracts. It's a conflict of interest. A director of a government department sitting as a private director on a private group getting grants from the Victorian government and contracts that she's responsible for. And I then presented to the federal parliamentary inquiry definitive evidence, the Articles of Association, the name of that director, because remember, I'm getting threatened by the directors of the Department of Health to prevent me from being the witness to nominate her chairman. Her chairman, Ken Buxton. And not only that, there are front page articles in the newspaper at the time that the Queen's Counsel for the Royal Commission into the Ambulance Inquiry and Intergraph graphs is asking serious questions. We've been running for years. When do I get to see this witness? Who was the person that organised the whole contracts for the ambulance services with Intergraph? And guess what? It's the same director. She's sitting as a director on Ken Buxton's company. Now, why I say that is that Michael gave me testimony independently that Promis was designed for the Intergraph VAX computers. A specially designed VAX computer for Intergraph was designed for CIA and NSA for Echelon. And she worked, the director worked for the company that arranged for Michael Riconosciuto, the owner of that company, was the person that arranged for Michael to work at Wackenhut Research Centre in the first place. So she came from the company where the owner of the company knows Michael Riconosciuto and employed him to work at Wackenhut for Promis software. I'm going to do a whole podcast on this because it's criminal. It's absolutely criminal that I'm a trusted advisor being destroyed, and then I get verification that Carlos was being destroyed by the same people. And remember, it's Rupert Murdoch's company that I have all the evidence sold the CIA's Promis software to the Australian government called the Lean software. And I'm going to do a whole podcast on that to show you how corrupt this was. So let's go ahead. There's the parliamentary inquiry. Terms of reference, September 2000, the Speaker referred the committee the following matter: the threats made against Peter Osborne. And there it is. I provided all my evidence and my closing statement. This does not make any sense. The only way they can be permitted to destroy Korea with governments and my encryption company given I've served as the most trusted government advisor and get away with this, is that ACCI is working for intelligence. That was my closing statement in camera. I received a public apology in the House, but they advised me they couldn't provide any financial compensation because the federal government has no jurisdiction over the state Victorian government in order to force them to make appropriate financial compensation. Isn't that great? They can do it and walk away. Anyway, the statement and apology was given to me in the House, but 21 years later, when I revealed Promis software was sold by Rupert Murdoch's company, and I can now prove that I was correct. Rupert Murdoch's company was working with CIA on the Promis software. So this is the podcast that we did previously. It's about our SEAL program. We've launched it. A bogus prince turns up and destroys it. There's the credibility that I had. They turned me down to give a Mr. Ken Buxton with no qualifications, no education in the areas of what we're talking about, and has never worked in a hospital or ever been a research director of medical divisions trusted to do these things. And there's the credibility I have. Endorsements of John Hopkins on the 3 volumes that we submitted. I had Spies Are Us, representing the encryption technologies for the encryption. Rosetta chips that are used by NSA and CIA. I'm working with KPMG, the auditors of John Hopkins, and also senior consultants to many government departments across Australia. And Carlos Morea, who's heading a genuine United Nations trade link, which is going to try and allow for all vendors to participate, no dominating technologies, and let's see if we can actually help some of the poorer nations with their services, particularly in trade. But he asked me to head up his healthcare side because of my credibility and links within governments, not business links, trusted links, because this is a business of trust. I can bridge all the medical providers, the technology companies, the investors trust me, and the governments that trust me. And I'm trying to put a partnership for development program together where we can make it commercially viable for everyone to invest, and then we can get an export market going. So credibility, unquestionable. There's the full endorsement. I've got all the speeches of Fran Bailey, Tim Fisher, and their efforts to help the United Nations do it, but it was undermined by the Victorian government's links with Rupert Murdoch's company, Ken Buxton, and ACCI. Just a reminder, let's have a look at the picture of the prince. Now remember this name. His Royal Highness Prince Haji Mohammed Al Sagoff van Aldik. Okay, he's adopted son of the Sultan of North Borneo. He's got his passport. Behind him is Jeff Moss, brother of Peter Moss. Peter Moss is known to be linked with intelligence in Australia and MI6 and CIA. And merchant banker working with the World Bank. He's involved in a major fraud case, money laundering cases in the US, charged relating to this. Okay, so let's go ahead. General Assembly. So embarrassing. They shut down the United Nations. Carlos Morea has to return back to Geneva to face the General Assembly inquiry. And there you go. Definitively, it's concerns about this prince. Prince of Sultan of Borneo, promised the responsible UNCTAD director and the Melbourne-based staff member that would contribute $1 billion to the United Nations Trade Point Development Centre to launch the scale of a project to develop global expansion and secured electronic authentic link seal, crucial for building block for the transition of electronic trading opportunities to secure electronic transactions. The prince did not prove to be authentic, but the lure of global electronic transactions had taken hold. So even the report says that it was damaging. So let's continue now to what the real story is. This is not a repeat of the court cases where all the people working for CIA operatives working for the director of CIA were already meeting with the prince and before he came across with the prince. Let's have a look. Have a look at this. I was investigating Promis and I found this letter. Bank of South Pacific Islands Limited, to whom it concerns. Prince Haji Mohammed Al Sagoff van Aldik with his bank and seal in the Philippines. I'm chasing after Promis. I found this in the evidence submitted by Leo Wanta. And you're going to learn more about him. Here is the letter. This is the prince. Have a look at this. This is June 3rd, 1998. It's a year after he's destroyed our program in Australia. Remember, CIA agents are meeting with him 3 months before he comes and does the job. He stays around and destroys us for a whole week. I have all my correspondence with the Department of Foreign Affairs confirming that they knew he was here, but no one ever spoke to him. They have no records of him coming in or leaving. He was never questioned. If he was a fake and it's being destroyed and it's all over the TV, how was he permitted to be there with the delegation at a hotel eating and drinking for another week? These are very important questions. But apparently Department of Foreign Affairs couldn't find any records of anything. Yet it's on national TV. It's beamed out to the US and overseas by CNN. And it's beamed onto our TVs in our front living rooms of homes, showing that he's a failed builder from Queensland, dumped his family, claiming to be a prince. But let me keep going. This is a letter as the chairman of this bank to Leo Wanta. And Leo Wanta is very important. Now, I found his records. And I can prove that Leo Wanta was connected with Robert Booth Nichols. Legally, I've got all the incorporation documents linking back to their companies in Australia, United Kingdoms, Singapore, Philippines. But this is the part that I was chasing. The companies that he's using are linked to Robert Booth Nichols, who came out and threatened me. But this is the part that I was chasing. He was testifying on documentaries that he was being destroyed by George Bush Sr., who was stealing all of the funds that he had done through Operation Steel Point for CIA to bankrupt the Soviet Union and moving billions and billions of dollars of gold bullion from Japan, the Philippines, Russia, through all the banks. He claims that George Bush murdered his partner, the chairman of his company, H.E. Hong Kwok Kwok, was murdered by George Bush because he wouldn't hand over all of the gold bullion and billions of dollars of funds from Operation Steel Point. CIA. He confirms in his evidence, he's got court cases going, that he was using CIA NSI, a proprietary Promis software that they had from Inslaw on the digital VAX and also an IBM 3090. Now the 3090 I know because that was at ACCI with Ken Buxton. You must understand this. The most important thing is that it's Promis being used. And I have the legal evidence that the companies were linked to Robert Booth Nichols with major investigations with CIA, FBI, linking back to the foundations and companies they're moving the gold bullion through from the Philippines, from Japan, from Russia. So I was chasing this when I found him, and that's when I found the rest. There's the confirmation of his chairman in his book. In his interviews, he's claiming that he worked for Ronald Reagan. His expertise was international currencies, and he met with Vincent Foster in Geneva, and worked with the Israel Prime Minister and with the US presidents, and was involved in their secret funding operation using the Promis software to bankrupt the Soviet Union for the Cold War. I'll go further. He then confirms about their investments and financial derivatives and such, but the book has even more. But the company names were the companies that I found in the incorporation documents, and directors over in the UK were linked directly to the testimonies of Robert Booth Nichols in court in 2007 when he was using the Promis software with the appropriate people. So that's independent verification, but what you're going to like is, remember, Robert Booth Nichols comes to Australia, threatens me, and says that he knows Ken Buxton. How would he know Ken Buxton? That wasn't on the TV documentaries. The TV documentary was talking about the fraud committed by John Hopkins. That part is really important. VAX, IBM 3090, CIA, NSA, US government proprietary INSLAW Promis software. So independently, I found the prince who destroyed me in Australia, and now I'm linking across to the prince that's working with Leo Wanta, the same one, and they're using the Promis software. I don't think it was by chance that Robert Booth Nichols turns up, and I don't think it's by chance that when I picked the phone up in 2000, January 2000, to call Bill Hamilton for the first time, ask him if he knows the company, Computer Power Group, that owns ACCI, the research centre for all the tax deductions for the syndication programs, he was in shock. They approached him in 82 at a hotel in Boston to requesting to become his distributor for the Inslaw's Promis software. They got all the tapes, the COBOL tapes. Dumped him, claiming they couldn't sell one copy. And that's when I said, well, that's not true. They sold the lean software to the Australian Federal Attorney General and integrated it, and it triggered a full parliamentary inquiry in 92 because it linked every record of every Australian citizen, including intelligence, defence, courts, social welfare, land titles. But Echelon, it was linked into DSD. It's called ASD today, but that is the branch that hooks into Echelon. In his book, he confirms, and this is the part that really got me really concerned. He does confirm that he was working for Ronald Reagan and was based in the office of Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos, because he's assisting him with the movement of the gold bullion. But this part, if you've watched all my other podcasts, you have to jump at this. How do I go from a bogus prince that destroys me, that's real, to Promis, to the Kuwait royal family? He says after the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Leo Wanta used his currency expertise with the Promis software to re-establish the value of the Kuwait currency. A letter of thanks from Kuwait. Danny was investigating the evidence of the Promis software. All roads led to Kuwait. Robert Booth Nichols flies urgently back from Kuwait. Joseph Queller flies back from Kuwait. Danny's last girlfriend, 4 weeks, whisked away to stay with the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait at the Watergate Hotel. Danny has the BCCI checks, financed, signed by Khashoggi and Gorbanifar, that never appeared at the BCCI inquiry, headed by Senator Kerry, as evidence, is missing from his whole briefcase, and documents are missing. Danny went to Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman, who reluctantly was meeting with because he was threatening to give his BCCI evidence to the BCCI inquiry. Have a look at the definitive independent evidence. Got nothing to do with Michael. Got nothing to do with Bill. It's purely my evidence of being destroyed by a bogus prince that's working with Leo Wanta. And now we've hit Promis and Kuwait. So let's go one more step. Just to reconfirm to you. Dated 1998. This is the link with Leo Wanta with the bogus prince in 1998. There's the bogus prince. There's the letter. He's involved in the fund movements of billions of dollars using his bank that's been set up with Leo Wanta. But have a look at this. Does this blow your mind? Operation Still Point on the letter of the bank, signed by the bogus prince, addressed to John Reed, by the way, but to President William Clinton. It's dated August 1998. Al Gore, Alan Greenspan, Robert Rubin. This name's very important. Robert Rubin. He ends up as a director of Citibank. Michael testified that the Promis software was installed at Citibank for CIA and Earl Bryan to move all of the CIA's covert funds through the SWIFT network. This is just incredible, and it's talking about the treasury bills that they're moving and laundering with the bogus prince. It's Operation Still Point. Independently, I found the court case where the bogus prince was meeting with CIA operatives March and June, April and June, before he appeared in Australia and destroyed us. He's already working with CIA. Then he's now working after that, a year later, he's still working with CIA in a major SWIFT Promis bullion transfer of Russian gold. Bullion from all those countries were going through this bank in the Philippines. And remember, Leo Wanta is located in the office of the President Ferdinand Marcos. This is talking about $500 million transfers, billions of dollars, secret funds, trade laws, Leo Wanta. It's addressed to the president. So the name of the bogus prince that our people don't contact is known as the fraud, is actually working as part of a CIA Operation Still Point for laundering US currencies and gold, bullion from Russia, Japan, Philippines. Have a look at this. Don't you just love it? This one is June 1998. It's addressed by the prince to Leo Wanta, using his bank and then appointing him as the Vatican representative. I mean, this is getting really good. The prince himself is confirming Leo Wanta's diplomatic passports and recognition with Vatican Bank. Now that part's very important. The checks that Danny had, financed by the Kuwait royal family, were done by Robert Sensi, CIA, operative working for William Casey, Robert Gray, and Clint Murchison. Also was meeting with the ambassador to the Vatican. Hence, it's not just this bank, it's the Vatican's bank. And it was Banca Ambrosiana overseas that I proved. The attorney owned a company with Alexander Haig, and hence the name Alexander Haig apparently was the cause of all my problems as I was being threatened by Robert Booth Nichols. He says, well, your problems lead to Alexander Haig. Well, no one knew that I'd uncovered the evidence linking Alexander Haig. This is independent evidence. I was searching for Promis and I found the bogus prints, was working as part of CIA Operation Still Point. And definitely it is a very high, signed letters by him. This one's April 1998. So while we're being destroyed in November 97, CIA is working with him before, the CIA is still working with him afterwards. But it goes to the attention of the President of the United States with the movement of billions and hundreds of billions of currencies and gold bullion as part of the operations for bankrupting the Soviet Union and rebuilding the Kuwait currency after Saddam Hussein has stolen all their gold bullion using the Promis software. So here we go, Ambassador at Large representation. You can't make this up because I have the legal evidence of the bogus prints coming out and destroying us. And an independent court case of all this where a court case has a settlement of 58 million because the CIA guys are already meeting with the bogus prince before he appeared in Australia. So I'll keep going. So we've got the Vatican, but this is the one that I was really interested in too. It's talking about massive currencies being exchanged. Now remember in the book, if you ever get a chance to read Leo Wanta's book, he confirms that he was meeting the week before Vincent Foster, who's working with Hillary Clinton, and Bill Clinton is found dead. He confirms that he had met him and transferred $250 million across to the Children's Fund. Can you see the definitive link? You can't make it up. A bogus prince that destroys us. Leo Wanta's communicating directly with Bill Clinton. He meets with Vincent Foster, transfers $250 million across to the account. Vincent Foster ends up dead a week later. It's all linked back to Promis. It's all linked back to the biggest money laundering operations as CIA Operation Still Point that continued under George Bush Sr., under Bill Clinton, and then continues under George Bush Jr. Now this part, that's the part that I'll go back to. Have a look at this. Danny Casolaro is investigating Promis. This is April 1991. It's a letter from the ambassador of Kuwait in Spain to Leo Wanta, thanking him for helping him restabilize the Kuwait dinar after the invasion. Leo Wanta's notes show that he used the Promis software to restabilize the Kuwait embassy's currencies, given the collapse and the theft of all their gold bullion. This is only 5 months before Danny dies. All evidence is leading for Promis. If it's used for currencies and SWIFT accounts, which Michael said was installed, and that's what it does, this is independent evidence that shows that what Danny was investigating on Promis and BCCI involves the Kuwait royal family. And the chance of Danny's new girlfriend of 4 weeks being whisked off to stay at the Watergate Hotel with the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait, while Danny goes down to Martinsburg to meet with Robert Altman with his signed cheques of BCCI financed by Kuwait royal family, whilst Robert Sensi was working for William Casey, Robert Gray and Clint Murchison, who's on the board of FIDCO with Robert Booth Nichols, and Robert Booth Nichols is flying back from Kuwait to be all over Danny. You can't make this evidence up. So let's go a bit further. In the documents that Leo Wanta presents as evidence that George Bush Sr. killed his partner in order to steal all the currencies that he was doing for CIA for presidents. He said he worked for Ronald Reagan, then he worked for George Bush Sr., and then he's working for Bill Clinton. And his allegations are, on TV programs and on radio and in his book, is that George Bush was stealing all of the currencies. George Bush Sr. was trying to get his hands on the currencies himself. Now this part's important. Leo Wanta then writes to George Bush Jr. This is January 2004 during my federal police investigation. A few months earlier, Honourable John Howard, the Prime Minister of Australia, had agreed, well, was willing to discuss the fact that I'm being destroyed by John Hopkins institutions and being defrauded. He was going to raise it with George W. Bush during his visit to Australia, but it was cut short, so he couldn't do it, and so had to refer my letter off to the Attorney General, which he did, and we then had an official federal police investigation going. And then the TV programs, SBS and ABC 730 Report, reveal all. And Robert Booth Nichols comes to Australia, contacts SBS, wants to meet with me. He's got evidence that can help my case against John Hopkins. And it turns out that he then makes threats against me, saying I'm upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen. All my problems lead to Alexander Haig, and if I continue to do my investigations, I'll get a crowbar to the back of the head, or the military will come down on me. And I also know Ken Buxton. You have to understand that in 2004, the next podcast will show that President Gerald Ford appeared and offered to negotiate with my attorneys $100 million settlement with the directors of John Hopkins. I'll say it again. By chance, President Gerald Ford appeared with his chief advisors and chief of staff with their company. I have all the signed letters, contracts, agreements, and they asked me to exchange my evidence that I had against John Hopkins, and they'd negotiate $100 million settlement for me. They wanted to keep $30 million for themselves to bankroll Jeb Bush to run for the president, and I get $70 million. Everything was going well until Robert Booth Nichols appears and threatens me. And then the chief of staff of President Ford learnt that I had the CIA evidence relating to the bogus prints. As soon as he knew that, his next statement was, would I be willing to have a secure line installed at my house so that I could give my evidence? And I said, yeah, happy to. They completely disappeared, abandoned me. But I've still got all the legal agreements. And the reason why it's embarrassing for them is that President Ford and C. Michael Armstrong, the chairman of John Hopkins Trustees, was also a director of Citibank, both of them. And Michael testified that in court that the Promis software for CIA was installed at Citibank and was used by Earl Bryan and CIA to launder the covert funds through international clearinghouses using SWIFT network. This is what this is. and I will prove it. So we've got this. So a letter's written to George Bush Jr., Richard Cheney, and John Ashcroft from Leo Wanta relating to all of Operation Still Point. I'm just pulling out all the key parts, but what they're doing is they're advising that with the bogus prints, they're going to be purchasing a bank from Greece. Copies of the investment companies and commercial transactions for the banks. So remember, they're moving Russian gold bullion and appropriate currencies. They own this bank. So he encloses to George Bush Jr. a copy of the letter from the bogus prince who destroyed us, confirming that they've got the arrangements with the Philippine National Bank. And confirming again, it's the same prince that destroyed us, was part of CIA Operation Still Point. It was a sting that destroyed Carlos Moreira's program, my encryption companies. We're just fodder for these clowns. Their operation for money laundering and destroying our encryption business, which was credible, is just a game to these people. But it goes to the top. Everything that happened to me was known by William Clinton, George Bush Jr., and George Bush Sr. So just confirming, Operation Still Point, confirmation of the currencies, but this is the part that's important. Global humanitarian projects and foundations they're all setting up. I have the testimony of Robert Booth Nichols and his connection to the Global Humanitarian Foundation that's established in the UK with the money laundering of 250 billion US security note that the FBI agents flew to London to recover from the bank vault. I have the testimony, the evidence, and the links to Leo Wanta's companies. Because Robert Booth Nichols was representing a $1 billion US currency of gold bullion in Switzerland, and I've got copies of that as well, for Ferdinand Marcos. And another gentleman that he testifies in court, both of them have it, was a guy called Herbert Fost. And it turns out that he was former US Navy intelligence and personal friend of Ferdinand Marcos, who was trusted to manage all of his gold bullion. So both Robert Booth Nichols and Leo Wanta were both working with the same person. And I have all the incorporation documents relating to the companies owned by Leo Wanta with him and with Robert Booth Nichols. So I'll just go forward, just to let you know, just to repeat these things. You can see the same letters and correspondence is given to George Bush Jr. William Clinton, copies were sent through to George Bush Jr. So everything that impacting me with the bogus prints probably couldn't be discussed with George Bush Jr. He wouldn't want to be involved. Well, they know. They know that they destroyed me. They destroyed the UN SEAL program with the bogus prints. And it's an official Operation Still Point for money laundering. It was the processes of Promis to bankrupt the Soviet Union, and it was also from the banking system, and it was also used to rebuild the Kuwait currency after the invasion by Iraq. But that's the part that ties it directly back to Danny Casolaro. I had already worked out before this that all roads seemed to point to Kuwait, CIA, BCCI, in everything. And now I've got the proof. But this letter from the ambassador at Kuwait, I'm going to show you is worth gold. So I've got the bogus prints still operating after destroying us, and an official level with CIA and presidents of the United States. And this ambassador who's involved with the reconstruction of the Kuwait dinar with the Promis software with Leo Wanta, with NSA, with CIA and Citibank. So let me go further. Have a look at this guy. His name is Yassim Mohammed Al-Saba. Okay, it's got Saba, but it's actually Sada. So the typing here is slightly different, but I found him. He was the ambassador to Spain. There's Leo Wanta, and this is when he's doing the application with the companies in Europe and across in Germany and other places, particularly Austria, for buying the Austrian bank. But Leo Wanta was also exposed in 1988, well before this, in selling guns, AK-47s, 5,000 semi-automatic pistols to, you name it, Manuel Noriega. Also trying to sell Panamerican military M16s. Can you see the overlap with Iran-Contra? Drugs being laundered by Noriega through SWIFT bank accounts using the Promis software. CIA Operation Still Point involves the Kuwait royal family financing all of the operations of Iran-Contra. And here it is, Operation Still Point. It's categoric. Letters from President Ronald Reagan to him for they're bankrupting Soviet Union, but they were also moving US currencies and securities from China. So it's the movement of bonds, security notes from China, Russia, Japan, the Philippines, gold bullion. Great way to launder drugs, arms. Bank of China. Japanese yen currencies. I mean, look at the figures here, guys. That's 500 billion. We're talking about 500 billion. In 2007, I'll do a separate podcast, but Robert Booth Nichols, who's working with Leo Wanta and also President George Bush Sr. and Ted Shackley and Robert Mayhew and George Pender, he was moving 250 billion US security note in 2004 and 5 when he came out to threaten me. And he states in the court that he was working for CIA, he worked for Frank Colucci. This is the same group of people who destroyed Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns. It's the octopus. Have a look at this. It's using all of the appropriate banks for laundering and fast-tracking the funds. Just to give you an idea, Japanese, Chinese, Russian. What amazes me is that you've got this going to the top of US White House. How many wars have we had with these countries, with young people being sacrificed in Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, everywhere worldwide, and then these guys go behind the scenes of doing deals with movement of gold and bullion with Russian mafia, with Italian mafia, with Golden Triangle, with Noriega. I'll continue with a couple just so you get an idea. Look at this. This is coming back to BNL, which is the agricultural grants and links back to the arms sales with Iraq. They were supplying weapons to Iraq, chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, under the disguise of agriculture. There was a whole investigation on the links of BNL and BCCI in the Iraqgate scandal. See, Leo Wanta has all these companies called AmeriChina, AmeriTrust, AmeriEurope. He can't make this stuff up because he can't invent it, because I witnessed the bogus prints. The bogus prints destroyed everything, and the people standing there are all linked with Nuganhan Bank, the Costigan Royal Commission for drugs and arms being sold and laundered through Australia, and they're all linked with intelligence people and banks. You can't make it up. So this one's with Brunei. We're looking at 1.2 billion here with Swiss bank accounts. They're buying up transactions and companies with the money. They buy infrastructure, they buy building, they buy lands. Whatever they can turn the currency in. But it'll be drugs and arms, money laundering. But this is the part you must understand. Promis is SWIFT. They can only do this through the SWIFT code, and I will do a whole podcast. I've got absolute definitive proof that the company that built the SWIFT network was a business venture partner with Rupert Murdoch's company in Australia, and with HADRON, and with CIA. They built the CIA SWIFT banking software for NSA Echelon to infiltrate. So you can track money worldwide and just take it. Every time you say, oh, that's some person doing something criminal, you just take it, put it in the Federal Reserve. But you also can disguise that no one will be able to see your laundering operations because you control all the intelligence software for detecting money laundering, the fox looking after the chicken coop. So let's have a look at this. Here's Leo Wanta in a court case with John Ashcroft. You can't make this stuff up. He talks about the CIA versus FBI over the BNL scandal involving Robert Gates. Now, that part's very important because when Danny's actually doing the investigation, Richard Babian and Ari Ben-Menashe are testifying that Robert Gates and CIA were involved in the Iraqgate, selling arms and chemical weapons and nuclear devices to Iraq. He talks about his role in working directly for Bill Casey. Wanta's working US with Russian mafia figures. It's all sanctioned. What he's saying is that it was all sanctioned, it was all known, it was their way of doing things in national security to bankrupt the Soviet Union. But the problem is you're allowing for a criminal network that runs everything and continues to do everything in the name of national security. And so he talks about here that he had secret meetings with Vincent Foster. Now that you can't make up. And two, that ties back to all the evidence that was uncovered about Promis with Vincent Foster, Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton. He confirms that he transferred $250 million across as requested by Vincent Foster to the Children's Fund. I'll come back and talk about this a bit more, but there's the Children's Fund, there's AmeriTrust Corporation. As I said, I have definitive evidence of it linked to Robert Booth Nichols. He confirms that it's linked with Richard Secord, particularly for Iran-Contra and arms sales that they're doing worldwide. But he's working with the Israeli Prime Minister and Defence as well, collaboratively. He then says that there's massive cover-up and says categorically that vast amount of information was known to the Federal Reserve. Defence Secretary Dick Cheney covered up the illegal arming of Iraq, made possible Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Now, when you do the research, you'll find that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait because he said he had evidence that they were drilling horizontally, using horizontal technology, of drilling technology, to steal his oil. That's probably what did trigger it. But we're talking about an octopus. Corruption, deception, and then you rape countries. You take all their resources and then you just launder it for personal gain. But this links directly to Kuwait. The Kuwait oil, the purposes of the war, and rebuilding the economy. And that's the part that also caught my attention. There was another book done by Claire Sterling, Thieves of the World. She gives full credit to Leo Wanta, the key figure in bringing down the ruble, collapse of the Soviet Union, but she still thinks that he is involved with some very criminal activities, and particularly linked to the mafia, the Russian mafia, and Italian, Illuminati and Freemasons and the PT2 Lodge. And this part's very important because it's the Vatican Bank, it's Banca Ambrosiana, and it's linked with Ted Shackley and Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger. I've done a huge amount of research on this side, and that's how I found Alexander Haig was owning a company with the attorney that ran Banca Ambrosiana, and he's linked to Richard Sedona and the Gambino Mafia. And she comes to the conclusion, independently, that there's a criminal cabal that runs the world of banking, finance and politics. I really have to agree. I'm following a bogus prince, and I'm finding the evidence of Promis independently from Australia. These are things that happened in Australia that are real, and I'm not making them up. So it independently finds it, and I haven't touched Bill Hamilton. I haven't touched Michael Riconosciuto in any of this evidence. This is just following the legal evidence that I found relating to us being destroyed by a bogus prince. And I think this statement at the end here is that Eisenhower was warning, he was worried about that there was a military industrial complex of intelligence that really runs things, runs White House, runs governments, and it's not loyal to a country. It's actually global. And that's why I called my book The Sixth Eye, because I will show you that Ted Shackley had set up the Sixth Eye, and I can prove it. So let's finish off with this bit. Here's some letters of endorsement from George Bush Sr. for Leo Wanta. So he's not making things up. Here's a letter from Gerald Ford. Now that part caught my attention. I couldn't work out why Gerald Ford's rolling up to negotiate $100 million settlement for me with John Hopkins. I mean, I'm just a little Australian, really. And he's going to have General Brent Scowcroft involved in the negotiations, who's one of the key figures for investigating Iran-Contra. But listen to this. Enclosed a resume for Leo Wanta, who desires to serve within the Reagan administration at a subject cabinet level of Department of Defense. I have known Mr. Wanta for many years. He is a loyal and dedicated worker who gets things accomplished. Is this the reason why Gerald Ford intervened? They destroyed me with the bogus prince. That's part of Operation Steel Point. He's sitting on the board of Citibank with C. Michael Armstrong, chairman of AT&T, who was a business partner of and alliance with Inslaw Inc. originally with the Promis software, but he's on John Hopkins. I wrote to him, and he was subject of my fraud investigation with the federal police. It went to the top. They knew that I had been defrauded. I'd been there so many times. They all knew who I was, and the doors I'm opening with the Prime Minister of Australia, the Treasurer of Australia, and the Health Ministers of Australia. They know my credibility. But the thing is, he actually is going to be impacted because Michael Riconosciuto has told me in 2004 that it was installed at Citibank at Transaction Technologies used by CIA and Dr. O'Brien for swift laundering of CIA's covert funds. And the evidence from the prints that destroyed me and the United Nations, plus also Hopkins' attempts to destroy me again when they take me to NSA's research centre at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics. I have a police investigation. I've got support from John Howard. He's going to raise it with George Bush Jr. Federal police investigation. He's going to come in and hopefully see if we can suppress it before it gets out of hand. Being on the board of Citibank with C. Michael Armstrong, and also he's the chairman of Johns Hopkins Trustees, I can see they were worried. On the board of Citibank is John Deutsch, former director of CIA, and Mr. Rubin, who's in these letters in Operation Steel Point. He's on the board of Citibank too. So that caught my attention. This one was really interesting. Leo Wanter also puts as evidence a letter back from the Prime Minister of Israel, Rabin, recognising the good work that he's done. So it's quite clear that Leo Wanter was trusted by presidents of the United States, had a role to play, did bankrupt the Soviet Union, but was also the key person for currencies and movement of gold bullion and currencies because of his expertise in currencies for Operation Steel Point, which is laundering massive quantities of gold bullion, US security notes and currencies from other countries in connection with Noriega and drugs and arms. So, not only have I found that, I've interviewed extensively Michael Cottrell. I tracked him down because of another matter, and I'll do a whole podcast on that, because it turns out that Bill Hamilton called me in January, I think it was January 2005, saying that he's learnt that Paul Wolfowitz is upset with all your research. So is Richard Pearl, and so is Douglas Faith. That must be the powerful Israeli businessman that Robert Booth Nichols was telling me I was upsetting with my investigation of Promis. That was only 2 months before Paul Wolfowitz got announced by George Bush Jr. that he's going to be the new president of the World Bank. I could see why he was upset, because I had all the notes of Danny and I was investigating. Danny was investigating and found the key people involved with World Bank with Inslaw's Promis software. And I found them too, got pictures of them, so I'll do a podcast on that. I got a feeling that my research was upsetting them a lot. And so he confirmed that, and Bill Hamilton gave me the name of the person from Pentagon that tipped him off about Paul Wolfowitz leading the charge to shut me down. And it turns out he's the same person who met with Michael Cottrell. And he's a Pentagon spy. And he's involved in companies in the Ukraine. Isn't that an interesting country at the topic at the moment? But he was the key person that was involved in tipping off these people and tipped off me that I was upsetting Paul Wolfowitz. And so Leo Wanter's whole area is that his gist of his story is he was sanctioned to do this. He was acting under executive order of multiple presidents. Sounds like Michael Riconosciuto. He's got B1 classifications, but he's just a druggie. But I know really what he did. 2, same with this guy. He was doing what he was told for the good of national security, but also for the country. And then George Bush Sr. moves in. He says that he killed my business partner in order because he wouldn't release all of this currencies. We're talking about trillions. Bush wanted to get his hands on it privately. Not for the country, but for his own empire. And so he has gone public with court cases saying he's not going to release it and that he needs protection and such forth. So his allegation is there's $4.5 trillion of settlement still due with the Bank of America, President George W. Bush and Federal Reserve Board. Involves the Deutsche Bank, CHIPS accounts and SWIFT accounts, Ambassador Wanta, $745 billion of stolen funds, and this part caught my attention. Bush Sr., Neil Bush, President Clinton, $2 trillion stolen. Let me show you that he's not making it up. Let's go back to those Kuwait letters. An ambassador to Spain, the Kuwait ambassador to Spain, thanking him for all his work to rebuild the currency of the dinar for Kuwait after the invasion in 1991. This is April 1991, only 3 or 4 months before Danny is killed. Confirming that Promis was being used on VAX computers, IBM computers, and it's Inslaw's Promis software. Refresh your memory. Here's the ambassador's name. Here's the date. April 1991, thanking him for rebuilding the Kuwait dinar. So I thought, why don't I find out who he really is? And there he is. It took me a while to track him down. One thing I've learnt with these crown princes and ambassadors, in their life they usually reverse all their names backwards and forwards and then change it a little bit to disguise themselves. If they've done something wrong, they seem to rejumble all their names around so that if you do a search you can't find him the first time. But I found him, and even though it had B's for Saba, like royal family, it's actually Sada. He was the ambassador to Spain. This is the guy, and he owns a company called Ignite Inc. And you're going to love this. It's Neil Bush. It's a company founded by Neil Bush. Go back. He says they were stealing the currency, and it involves Bush Sr. and Neil Bush and President Clinton stealing them over $2 trillion. So let's go to find out. It took me months and months to find this company. All the evidence that Danny was investigating went to Ted Shackley and George Bush, to the top, with the Promis software. The BCCI accounts, it was known that Bush had BCCI accounts. The accounts details and the people paid by BCCI in White House, the evidence was sent by the auditors of BCCI London for the investigation, and it got lost in Customs, USA. That evidence never turned up. It had the names and who were being paid within White House, Justice, and I think it was Treasury as well, US Treasury, on the payroll of BCCI, and had bank accounts with BCCI. He was also investigating Neil Bush. There was evidence that Danny was looking at relating to George Bush Sr. and Neil Bush. But I'm going to go one further. This is for Danny. His evidence went to Kuwait. They paid for the checks. The evidence was well known. Casey, Robert Gray, involves Clint Murchison on the board of Fidco with Robert Booth Nichols and also Robert Mayhew and George Pender. Girlfriend whisked away to stay with this man while Danny's alone. Photographs of that Crown Prince and Prime Minister who's at Kuwait, at the Watergate Hotel, is always photographed with presidents. Just to recap, they both flew back from Kuwait urgently to be with Danny and help him with his investigations. Joseph Queller on the left arranged the fatal meeting. He's former CIA. Robert Burt Nichols testifies he's not employed by CIA, he works for Frank Colucci and CIA on matters, he says, that were anti-American in Australia during the 70s and 80s, and also is working on many things with Robert Mayhew and George Pender for NSC, and involves gold bullion and drugs and arms. And he also launders the gold bullion for Ferdinand Marcos personally. And Leo Wanter is based in Ferdinand Marcos's office during all the days he's in power. So I'm leading now to this ambassador who owns Ignite. What do you think the chance would be that the guy thanking Leo Wanter for restabilising the dinar of Kuwait using the Promis software also owns a company with Neil Bush, George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr. and the Russian mafia? Sound unbelievable? Operation Still Point involves the bogus prince that destroys me, and all roads lead to here. I'll confirm, that's his name, that's him, and there's the incorporation documents. Ignite Inc. 2002. 2002 they set up a company. It's just an education company. Why would you need presidents and ambassadors to run an education company? I work in education. This is just a front for laundering. You've got to get the money back somehow. There's Neil Bush, the founder. And there's your ambassador, who thanked Leo Wanter for using the Promis software for restabilising the currency of dinar 2 months before Danny dies, investigating the checks that were financed by the royal family of Kuwait for William Casey, Robert Gray, Clint Murchison, for Iran-Contra tow missiles. He also has on it Winston Wong, Timothy Bridgewater, Crest Financial, and here is an article, Bush family profits from No Child Act. And it says here, with investments from his parents. So Neil Bush has investments from George Bush Sr., Barbara Bush, Neil Bush's company are investors in it. Isn't it interesting that helped by Ignite, backed by Reverend Sun Myung Moon, South Korea Unification Church, that's where he was personal friend of Alexander Haig. Oil companies all chipping into this education company. Sounds like you've got to bring the money home somewhere. And it says Bush's parents joined Neil, investor, in 1999. He also has the ambassador for Kuwait and Winston Wong, Chinese computer firm, and also Russian fugitives, tycoons. 2 of them. How many wars have we had to kill off criminals? And you can then be involved with Operation Still Point, laundering gold bullion on such a large scale, selling arms to Noriega, moving his drugs. How much blood has been spilt? And here's a summary of all the investors. But it gets really interesting. Winston Wong started Grace Semiconductor with the Chinese president's eldest son. Unbelievable. This is all roads leading back to a company from... I started my investigation from the bogus prince that destroyed us. I proved that the CIA was working with him 6 months before he comes and destroys us in Australia. He's still working with CIA on Operation Still Point And then the ambassador who's working with him and Leo Wanta is now setting a company up with the Bush family. That summarises that Danny Casolaro was following the money. The company also involves associates of the Egyptian presidents, former Iranian ambassadors, all the countries that we seem to have a problem with war is all coming back together in a company with George Bush Sr., Neil Bush, and his family. But the other name, and I won't do it right now, is it also goes back to Ed Rogers, Frank Colucci. I'll do that as a separate one. And the Kyle Group. And why I say that is when Robert Booth Nichols came to Australia, he said he was working for a large investment firm to buy out Ron Evans' company, Healthscope. And when he said Ron Evans, I immediately remembered Kerry Kriers arranged a breakfast meeting for me to meet with Ron Evans when he was chairman and founder of Spotless. And John Hopkins was planning to buy Spotless out so that it could actually have a company they needed for all of Asia for hospitals, the cleaning business of hospitals and service and support. The fact that Robert Booth Nichols is going to meet with Ron Evans to buy that company told me it was linked to John Hopkins' Kerry Kriers. Because you can't make that up. But it turns out 2 years later, the company that bought out Healthscope, owned by Ron Evans, was the Kyle Group, Frank Colucci's company. And that supported the testimony that Robert Booth Nichols gave himself in 2007 in court when caught laundering $250 billion US security note with John Prescott Ellis, the nephew of George Bush Sr. and cousin of George Bush Jr. He confirms that he worked on matters with CIA and Frank Colucci back in the 70s and 80s to suppress anti-American activities, which clearly was the Loans Affair to destroy Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns, the Federal Treasurer. And that's why Danny Casolaro was going to have 3 chapters in his book. Nugan Bank, the dismissal of Gough Whitlam, and the other one was going to be on Costigan Royal Commission, which I'll do as a separate podcast, which involves Robert Booth Nichols, Nugan Bank, arms and drugs with the painters and dockers. So now you've gone on a very big journey, but I start from Australia. No one knows this evidence. No one understands the links. It's not simple. It's quite complex. That's how the octopus gets away with it. But over 21 years, when you collapse down the probability in 3-dimensional space, so in 3D and time is 4D over 21 years, you can't make this up. You can't throw a dice and get all the ducks to line in a row. This is real. This is fact. Everything leads to Kuwait. Everything leads to CIA. Everything leads to Promis. Everything leads to international cartel of bank money laundering on a scale you've never seen before using the Promis software. So I've taken you from here, bogus prints, down to here, and the next one I'm going to do is what would be the chance of President Ford coming to the rescue of Mr. Peter Osborne to settle $100 million negotiate a $100 million settlement with the board of John Hopkins unless they knew they had destroyed me back here. and then destroyed me again with John Hopkins, and then felt politically embarrassed that I had good relationships with Honourable John Howard. I dedicate the head of the octopus to the incredible research of Danny Casolaro. He had the smoking gun and it cost him his life. I am willing to help the son, Trey Casolaro, to reopen overwhelming evidence that his father was murdered. And I've already given testimony. I have the recorded transcripts of my interview with Thomas Gates, the FBI agent that was speaking to Danny for an hour and a half, only days before he went down, and he believes that Danny was murdered. I'm hoping that through podcasts that the case will be opened, Thomas Gates will do the right thing, an investigation will show that Danny was murdered. It's not simple, it's complicated. But I love complex things to solve. And now I understand that it wasn't just bad luck, that my things were destroyed. I just happened to step on the wrong toes. I was innocent. Bill Hamilton was innocent. Michael was innocent. He knows so much. But I'm validating my evidence from Australia, and you can't make it up.